Jack Mercer found the 300-foot cargo freighter sitting impossibly on the beach with no crew aboard, just 32 sets of clothing arranged in perfect circles around a hole that went deeper than the ship's hull should allow. The metal walls were warm to his touch, footsteps echoed from the empty deck above, and the voices whispering through the darkness were speaking a language that made his blood run cold. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Mercer had learned to expect little from life, and life had obliged by giving him exactly that. At 28 years old, he owned nothing but the clothes on his back, a battered saddle that had belonged to his grandfather, and Dusty, a chestnut mare who was as stubborn as she was loyal. They made their living the hard way, hiring out for odd jobs along the coastal ranch lands of Northern California, mending fences, herding strays, doing whatever work no one else wanted for wages that barely kept them fed. It was a precarious existence, one bad winter or one serious injury away from complete destitution, but it was all Jack had ever known. The morning he discovered the ship started like any other. He woke before dawn in the line shack at the edge of the Morrison Ranch, a drafty structure that leaked when it rained and offered little protection from the wind that came howling off the Pacific. His employer, Old Man Morrison, had hired him for 2 weeks to check fence lines along the coastal property, isolated work that suited Jack just fine. He preferred the company of Dusty and his own thoughts to the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed him in town. People knew his story, how his father had drunk himself to death, how his mother had abandoned him when he was 12, how he had bounced from ranch to ranch ever since, never quite belonging anywhere. He saddled Dusty as the first gray light crept across the horizon, his breath visible in the cold October air. The mare nickered softly, her warm breath steaming as she nuzzled his shoulder in greeting. This horse was the only constant in his life, the only creature that depended on him and never judged him for his failures. He ran his hand along her neck, feeling the solid muscle beneath her rough coat, and for a moment allowed himself to feel grateful for this one small blessing. The coastal trail led them along the edge of cliffs that dropped dramatically to the ocean below. Jack had ridden this path for 3 days now, and each time he was struck by the raw beauty of it, the way the morning light turned the waves to molten gold, the cry of gulls wheeling overhead, the smell of salt and kelp heavy in the air. It was a lonely landscape, harsh and unforgiving, but it spoke to something in his soul that the civilized world never had. Around mid-morning, as he guided Dusty down a steep switchback toward a stretch of beach where Morrison kept a section of drift fence, he saw it. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the massive dark shape hulking on the sand was some kind of rock formation, or perhaps a dead whale. But as they drew closer, the impossible truth revealed itself. A ship, easily 300 feet long, sat beached on the sand like some prehistoric creature that had crawled from the depths to die. Dusty snorted and danced sideways, her ears flattened against her skull. Jack felt his own pulse quicken as he took in the sight before him. The vessel was a cargo freighter, he could tell that much from its industrial shape and the rusted cranes that jutted from its deck like broken fingers. Its hull was streaked with rust and covered in barnacles, evidence of long years at sea, but what struck him most was the profound wrongness of finding such a ship here. There were no harbors nearby, no shipping lanes that came this close to shore, no logical explanation for how something this massive could have ended up beached on this isolated stretch of California coastline. He dismounted slowly, keeping a firm grip on Dusty's reins as she continued to shy away from the ship. The mare's instincts were usually sound, and her fear sent a prickle of unease down his spine. Still, curiosity had always been both his greatest asset and his most dangerous flaw. He had to see this up close, had to understand what he was looking at. The ship towered above him as he approached on foot, leading Dusty, who followed reluctantly, her hooves dragging in the wet sand. Up close, the vessel was even more imposing, its hull rising at least 40 feet above the beach. Rust streaked down its sides in patterns that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and the metal groaned with each surge of the tide, a sound that reminded Jack of a wounded animal crying out in pain. Along the side, barely visible beneath the corrosion, he could make out numbers and letters in a script he did not recognize, foreign markings that only added to the mystery. He tied Dusty to a piece of driftwood well away from the ship, speaking softly to calm her as he worked. The mare's eyes showed white at the edges, and she stamped her feet nervously, but she trusted him enough to stay put. Jack pulled his worn leather jacket tighter against the wind and circled the ship, looking for some way to board. The vessel sat at an angle, listing heavily to one side, and the beach sloped upward where it had been driven into the sand by what must have been tremendous force. On the landward side, he found a section of hull where the metal had buckled inward, creating a tear in the ship's side large enough for a man to squeeze through. The edges of the wound were sharp and jagged, and Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to mount Dusty and ride away from this place as fast as her legs could carry them. But he had spent his entire life being cautious, playing it safe, and where had that gotten him? Still poor, still alone, still drifting from one temporary job to the next, with nothing to show for nearly 3 decades of existence. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you are enjoying this story so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have got something even more incredible lined up for you. Jack approached the tear in the hull carefully, mindful of the sharp edges. As he drew closer, a smell hit him. Faint at first, but growing stronger with each step. It was the odor of decay, of things left too long in darkness, of rot and rust, and something else he could not quite identify. Something that made his stomach clench with primitive fear. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, but it did little to block the stench. The interior of the ship was dark, illuminated only by the weak sunlight that filtered through the opening and a few other small holes in the hull. Jack stood at the threshold, peering into the gloom, waiting for his eyes to adjust. Gradually, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. He could make out what appeared to be a cargo hold, empty except for scattered debris and pools of standing water that reflected the light in oily rainbows. He climbed through the opening, his boots squelching in something wet and unpleasant. The floor was slanted at a severe angle, making it difficult to maintain his balance. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that echoed through the empty spaces. The walls were covered in rust, and what might have been mold, black patches that spread across the metal like cancer. As his eyes adjusted further, Jack began to make out more details. There were markings on the walls, not the official numbering you would expect on a cargo ship, but something else. Scratches, deliberate and organized, as if someone had been counting days or keeping track of something. He moved closer to examine them, his hand trailing along the wall for balance, and that was when he felt it. The wall was warm. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his heart suddenly pounding. The ship had been beached for who knew how long, exposed to the cold Pacific air and water. There was no reason for the metal to be warm, no logical explanation for the heat he had felt beneath his palm, but there it was, undeniable and deeply wrong. A sound came from deeper in the ship, a metallic groan that might have been the hull settling, or might have been something else entirely. Jack froze, every muscle in his body tensed, his breath coming short and fast. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, listening. The sound did not repeat, but in the silence that followed, he became aware of something else. A vibration, subtle but constant, coming from somewhere below his feet. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing through the bones of the dead ship. He should leave. He knew he should leave, should climb back through that opening, mount Dusty, and ride straight to the Morrison ranch house to report what he had found. Let someone else, someone with authority and resources, deal with this mystery. But Jack Mercer had spent his whole life doing what he should do, and it had earned him nothing but poverty and loneliness. He pulled a match from his pocket and struck it against the wall, cupping the flame with his hand. The small light pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal a doorway ahead, a passage leading deeper into the ship's interior. The vibration seemed stronger in that direction, and despite every rational thought screaming at him to turn back, Jack found himself moving toward it. The passage was narrow and claustrophobic, forcing him to turn sideways in places where the walls had buckled inward. His match burned down to his fingers, and he lit another, then another, working his way deeper into the ship's guts. The warmth increased as he went, and with it the smell grew worse, taking on notes of copper and something sickeningly sweet. He emerged into what must have once been a crew quarters, though it bore little resemblance to any sailor's berth he had ever seen. The bunks had been torn from the walls, the metal twisted and bent as if by tremendous force. The floor was covered in more of those scratches, thousands of them, covering every surface in a chaotic pattern that hurt to look at, and in the center of the room something that made Jack's blood run cold, a pile of clothing, neatly stacked and carefully arranged. Not scattered as you would expect from an abandoned ship, but organized, deliberate. Shirts and pants and boots, dozens of sets, maybe more, all empty, all waiting, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and walked away, leaving nothing behind but the fabric shells of their former selves. Jack's match burned out, plunging him back into darkness, and for several heartbeats he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. The image of those empty clothes was seared into his mind, and with it came a flood of questions he did not want to answer. Where had the crew gone? Why had they left their clothing behind? And why, in the name of all that was holy, had they arranged everything so carefully before they disappeared? His hands shook as he fumbled for another match, nearly dropping the entire box in his haste. When light finally flared again, he forced himself to look more closely at the pile. The clothes were old, he could see that now, faded and stiff with salt and time. Some were uniforms, work coveralls with patches that might once have indicated rank or function, now too deteriorated to read. Others were civilian clothes, simple shirts and trousers that spoke of ordinary men doing ordinary work. But there was nothing ordinary about the way they had been left. He counted at least 30 sets, possibly more buried beneath the visible layers. 30 men, perhaps the entire crew of the ship, all gone without a trace. Jack had heard stories from sailors in port towns, tales of ghost ships found drifting with no one aboard, of crews that vanished in the night leaving meals half-eaten and watches still ticking. He had always dismissed such stories as superstitious nonsense, the kind of yarns old seamen spun to frighten greenhorns. But standing here in the darkness, surrounded by the physical evidence of such an impossibility, he found those dismissals crumbling like sand. A new sound reached his ears, faint but distinct. Footsteps, or something that sounded like footsteps, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above him, from the deck perhaps, or from one of the upper levels of the ship. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He had tied Dusty well away from the vessel. There was no one else here. There could not be anyone else here. The ship was abandoned, derelict, a tomb for whatever mystery had consumed its crew. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried, moving across what sounded like metal flooring, back and forth, as if someone were pacing or patrolling. Jack backed toward the doorway he had entered through, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above him, watching for any sign of movement. The match in his hand was burning low again, and he made the decision not to light another. Better to move through the darkness and risk injury than to advertise his presence with a flame. He felt his way back through the narrow passage, moving as quickly as he dared, his hands sliding along the warm metal walls. The vibration he had felt earlier was stronger now, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from below him, from the deepest parts of the ship. It pulsed in time with something, a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, like a heart with an irregular beat. Halfway back to the tear in the hull, Jack's foot caught on something and he stumbled, barely catching himself against the wall. He reached down to feel what had tripped him, and his hand closed on something that made every hair on his body stand on end. It was a boot, a worn leather work boot still laced with something inside it. He snatched his hand back with a gasp, his mind refusing to process what his fingers had told him. There was still a foot in that boot. Bones, certainly. No flesh remaining after what must have been years in this dark place. But bones nonetheless. Bones that should have been inside one of those neatly stacked sets of clothing, not lying scattered in a passageway. Jack abandoned all pretense of stealth and ran. He crashed through the narrow passage, bouncing off walls, not caring about the noise he made, caring only about reaching that blessed opening that led back to daylight and sanity. Behind him, the footsteps above increased their pace, no longer slow and measured, but quick and purposeful, as if whatever made them had heard him and was giving chase. He burst through the tear in the hull and half fell, half jumped to the sand below, landing hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. For a moment he lay there gasping, tasting salt and bile, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Then Dusty's panicked whinny cut through his shock, and he scrambled to his feet. The mare was rearing against her tether, her eyes rolling white, foam flecking her mouth. Jack ran to her, speaking in low, urgent tones, trying to calm her even as his own panic threatened to overwhelm him. He got the rope untied with shaking hands and swung himself into the saddle just as Dusty began to bolt. He did not try to stop her. He gave her her head and let her run, away from that cursed ship, away from the impossible things he had seen inside it. They galloped down the beach, sand flying from Dusty's hooves, the roar of the surf competing with the thunder of his pulse in his ears. Jack did not look back. He could not look back. If he looked back, he might see something following them, might see whatever had been making those footsteps emerging from the ship to give chase. His imagination supplied 100 horrible possibilities, and he pushed Dusty faster, urging her on with voice and heel. It was only when they reached the base of the cliff trail, a good mile from the beached ship, that Jack finally dared to glance over his shoulder. The vessel sat where they had left it, dark and silent and seemingly lifeless. Nothing moved on its deck. Nothing emerged from the tear in its hull. In the bright light of midday, it looked almost mundane, just a wrecked ship slowly being reclaimed by rust and tide. But Jack knew better now. He knew there was something deeply wrong with that ship, something that went beyond mere abandonment or maritime disaster. Those empty clothes, that lone boot with its grisly contents, the warmth in the walls, the footsteps in the darkness. None of it made sense. All of it terrified him in ways he could not articulate. He turned Dusty toward the Morrison ranch house, knowing he had to report what he had found, but already dreading the conversation. What would he say? That he had found a beached ship with no crew? That much they could verify. But the rest of it, the warm walls and the footsteps and the carefully arranged clothing, those things sounded like the ravings of a man who had spent too long alone, a man whose grip on reality was questionable at best. People already looked at Jack Mercer with pity and suspicion, the poor cowboy with no family and no prospects, drifting from job to job with no future and no hope. If he started talking about ghost ships and phantom footsteps, they would think he had finally cracked, that the isolation and poverty had driven him mad. They would thank him for reporting the ship, certainly, but they would also mark him as unreliable, as someone whose word could not be trusted. And in a world where a man's word was often the only currency he had, that was a judgment Jack could not afford. As Dusty climbed the switchback trail, her breathing labored from the hard run, Jack made a decision. He would report the ship's presence to Morrison, but nothing more. He would say he had seen it from a distance, that it appeared to be a derelict cargo vessel, and that someone should notify the proper authorities. He would not mention going inside. He would not speak of what he had found there. Those secrets would remain his burden alone, at least for now. The wind picked up as they reached the top of the cliff, carrying with it the smell of the ocean and something else, something that might have been decay or might have been his imagination. Jack turned in the saddle for one last look at the beach below. The ship sat there like a sleeping giant, its secrets locked in darkness, waiting for the next fool who thought he was brave enough to uncover them. Old Man Morrison was in the corral when Jack rode up to the ranch house, working with a young stallion that had been giving the hands trouble all week. The rancher looked up as Dusty trotted into the yard, and even from a distance Jack could see his expression shift from mild curiosity to concern. Morrison was in his 60s, weathered and wise in the ways of horses and men, and he could read trouble in the set of a rider's shoulders the way some men read books. Jack dismounted, his legs unsteady beneath him. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the ride from the beach was draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel like wading through mud. Dusty was lathered with sweat despite the cool October air, her flanks heaving, foam dripping from her mouth. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took in the mare's condition, then shifted to Jack's face with an unspoken question. "You look like you've seen the devil himself," the rancher said, climbing over the corral fence with the easy grace of a man who had been doing it for 50 years. "What happened out there?" Jack opened his mouth to deliver the carefully rehearsed explanation he had prepared during the ride, the simple story of spotting a beached ship from a distance and thinking it should be reported. But what came out instead was the truth, or at least a version of it. "There's a ship," he said, his voice hoarse and strange to his own ears, "down on the south beach past the second bend. Big cargo freighter, 300 feet at least, just sitting there in the sand like it's been there for years." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "A ship? How in blazes did a ship that size get beached on my property?" "That's what I'd like to know," Jack replied. "There's no way it could have come in through the rocks, not without tearing itself to pieces. But there it is, solid as stone." The rancher studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You go aboard?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jack felt his carefully constructed wall of omission begin to crumble. Morrison was not the kind of man you could lie to easily. He had spent too many years dealing with drifters and hired hands, learning to separate truth from fiction, to spot a man hiding something. Just inside, Jack admitted, wanted to see if anyone was aboard, if there were survivors or bodies or anything that might explain what happened. Morrison's expression darkened. And nothing, just some old clothes and debris, no sign of the crew. The partial truth felt like a stone in his gut, but it was all he could bring himself to share. The warm walls, the footsteps, the boot with its terrible contents, those things remained locked away, too strange to speak aloud without sounding like a madman. "I'll need to ride down there and have a look myself," Morrison said, already turning toward the barn. "Then I'll send one of the boys into town to fetch the sheriff. This is bigger than just a maritime matter. If there's a derelict vessel on my land, there'll be salvage claims and insurance companies, and Lord knows what else crawling all over the place before the week is out." Jack felt a twist of anxiety in his chest. "You going now?" Morrison paused, reading something in Jack's tone that made him turn back. "Why? You afraid of something out there?" The question was asked casually enough, but Jack could feel the weight of scrutiny behind it. Morrison was testing him, trying to determine if his hired hand had lost his nerve or his wits. "Just thought you might want to wait until morning," Jack said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Tide's coming in, and the beach gets cut off when it's high. Could be dangerous." It was a reasonable excuse and true enough as far as it went. But Morrison's eyes told Jack he was not fooled. The rancher had seen the state of Dusty, had noted the tremor in Jack's hands, the pallor beneath his sun-darkened skin. He knew fear when he saw it, and he was seeing it now in his hired cowboy. "Fair point," Morrison said finally. "We'll go at first light tomorrow. You can show me where it is." The relief Jack felt was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by shame. What kind of man was he to be so terrified of an empty ship that he could not face it again even in daylight with another man beside him? But the shame did nothing to diminish the fear. If anything, it made it worse, adding self-loathing to the toxic mixture of emotions churning in his gut. He tended to Dusty with hands that still shook slightly, brushing the dried sweat from her coat, checking her legs for injury, speaking to her in the low, soothing tones that had always calmed them both. The mare was his only friend in this world, the only creature that depended on him absolutely, and he owed her better than to have run her half to death fleeing shadows and phantoms. That night, Jack lay in his bunk in the line shack, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and listening to the wind howl around the corners of the building. Sleep eluded him despite his exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those empty clothes arranged so carefully, felt the warmth of the ship's walls beneath his palm, heard those measured footsteps pacing above him in the darkness. His mind conjured explanations, each more terrible than the last. A plague ship, perhaps, where the crew had died of some horrible disease and their bodies had been thrown overboard, but that did not explain the warm walls or the vibration he had felt pulsing through the deck. Pirates, then, who had killed the crew and taken the ship, only to abandon it when they realized they could not sail it to a safe harbor. But pirates would have stripped the vessel of anything valuable, and Jack had seen crates and equipment still secured in the cargo hold. Whatever had happened to the crew, it had happened suddenly, without warning, without time to mount a defense or salvage anything of value. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep entirely and lit the oil lamp, using the meager light to examine his hands. They were steady now, the adrenaline long since metabolized, leaving behind only a dull sense of dread that sat in his stomach like a lump of lead. He thought about Morrison's plan to visit the ship at first light, and something close to panic rose in his throat. He did not want to go back there. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stay away, to let someone else deal with whatever mysteries that cursed vessel contained. But he could not refuse without arousing Morrison's suspicion, without confirming whatever doubts the rancher already harbored about his hired hand's reliability. Jack Mercer might be poor, might be alone, might be one bad season away from starvation, but he was not a coward, or at least he had never thought of himself as one until today. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the cold night air, needing to clear his head to escape the claustrophobic confines of the line shack. The stars were brilliant overhead, uncountable millions of them scattered across the black vault of heaven like diamond dust. Out here, far from the lights of civilization, the night sky was something to behold, a reminder that the world was vast and mysterious and full of wonders that human minds could barely comprehend. But tonight, the stars offered no comfort. They seemed cold and distant, indifferent to the small dramas of men scrambling across the surface of the earth below them. Jack walked to the edge of the cliff, careful to stay back from the drop-off, and looked down at the beach below. In the darkness, he could just make out the hulking shape of the ship, a black mass against the slightly lighter sand. No lights showed aboard. No movement disturbed its stillness. It sat there like a monument to some forgotten catastrophe, patient and waiting. A sound reached his ears, faint and distant, carried on the wind from the direction of the ship. It might have been the creak of metal settling, or the cry of a gull disturbed from its roost. Or it might have been something else entirely, something that sounded disturbingly like a human voice calling out across the darkness. Jack strained his ears, trying to separate the sound from the constant rush of the surf and the whistle of wind through the grass, but it did not repeat. He stood there for a long time, watching and listening, waiting for something he could not name. Eventually, the cold drove him back inside, but sleep remained elusive. He lay in his bunk, fully dressed, watching the rectangle of window gradually lighten with the approach of dawn, dreading what the new day would bring. When Morrison came for him an hour after sunrise, Jack was already saddled and waiting, dusty, refreshed from a night's rest and eager to move. The rancher rode a big gray gelding that had carried him for years, steady and reliable. Together, they started down the coastal trail, neither man speaking much, both lost in their own thoughts. The morning light made the ship look different than it had the day before, less menacing perhaps, more mundane. In the clear autumn sunshine, it was easier to see the details Jack had missed in his initial encounter. The rust was not just surface corrosion, but deep structural decay that had eaten through portions of the hull. Seabirds had made nests in the cranes and rigging, their droppings painting white streaks down the dark metal. It looked less like something supernatural and more like simple human tragedy, a vessel that had met an unfortunate end and been left to rot. Morrison reined in his horse 100 yards from the ship, his eyes sweeping over it with the practiced assessment of a man who had learned to evaluate problems quickly and thoroughly. "That is one hell of a thing," he said finally. "Must have come in during a storm, driven up onto the beach by the waves, but I cannot figure how it got past the rocks offshore. Those formations would tear the bottom out of anything that tried to come through them." Jack said nothing, watching the ship for any sign of the activity he had heard the day before, the footsteps, the vibration, the sense of presence that had driven him fleeing in panic. In the daylight, with Morrison beside him, those things seemed almost ridiculous, the product of an overactive imagination working in the dark. But the memory of that boot with its grim contents was real enough, as was the warmth he had felt in the walls. "Let us take a closer look," Morrison said, dismounting and tying his horse beside Dusty. Jack followed suit, his reluctance warring with the need to maintain his employer's respect. They approached the ship on foot, and with each step Jack felt the dread from yesterday returning. It started as a flutter in his stomach, a vague uneasiness that might have been nerves or bad coffee. But as they drew closer to the tear in the hull, it grew into something more substantial, a visceral wrongness that made his skin crawl. Morrison, to his credit, seemed to feel it too. The rancher's pace slowed as they neared the opening, and Jack saw his hand drift unconsciously to the rifle he carried. "You said you went inside?" Morrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Just through there," Jack confirmed, pointing to the jagged opening, into what looked like a cargo hold, then through a passage to the crew quarters. "That is where I found the clothes." "Clothes," Morrison repeated. "Just lying around?" "Not lying. Stacked, organized, like someone had folded their laundry and just left it there." Morrison shot him a look that suggested he thought Jack might be exaggerating, but he said nothing. Instead, he pulled a flashlight from his saddlebag, a modern electric torch that threw a powerful beam. "Better than matches," he said, and climbed through the opening. Jack followed with profound reluctance, every fiber of his being screaming at him to turn around and walk away. Inside, the ship looked much as it had yesterday. The same slanted floor, the same pools of oily water, the same patches of rust and mold spreading across the walls. But Morrison's flashlight revealed details Jack had missed in his brief, panicked exploration. There were marks on the walls beyond the scratches he had noted before. Symbols, crude but deliberate, carved or painted into the metal. They reminded Jack of something he had seen once in a book about ancient civilizations, pictographs or hieroglyphics, attempts to communicate through images rather than words. But these symbols were not ancient. The paint where it had been used was relatively fresh, and the carved marks showed clean metal beneath the rust, suggesting they had been made recently. Morrison played his light over the symbols, his face set in grim concentration. "You see this yesterday?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "It was dark. I was using matches. I could not see much detail." The rancher grunted and moved deeper into the ship, following the passage Jack had taken the day before. As they walked, Jack became aware once again of that warmth in the walls, more pronounced now than it had been. Morrison must have felt it too, because he stopped and placed his palm flat against the metal. "That is not right," the rancher said quietly. "This ship has been sitting in cold ocean water for God knows how long. There is no reason for it to be warm." "Could be the sun heating the metal," Jack suggested, though he did not believe it himself. The passage they were in received no direct sunlight, and the warmth was coming from inside the walls, not from the surface. Morrison did not bother to respond to such an obvious falsehood. He continued forward until they reached the crew quarters where Jack had found the pile of clothing. In the bright beam of the flashlight, the scene was somehow even more disturbing than it had been by flickering matchlight. The clothes were exactly as Jack remembered, neatly arranged in stacks that spoke of care and intention. But there were other details visible now, things he had missed in his hasty examination. Each stack was positioned with precision, as if following some pattern or design. Morrison counted them aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. 32, he said finally. 32 sets of clothes. That would be about right for a crew this size. "Where did they go?" Jack asked, though he did not expect an answer. Morrison walked slowly around the room, his flashlight picking out more of those strange symbols on the walls, on the floor, even on the ceiling. "Someone was trying to tell a story here," the rancher said, "or leave a warning." The boot Jack had tripped over was still lying in the passage, and Morrison's light found it as they retraced their steps. The rancher knelt beside it, his face grim as he examined the contents. "Bones," he confirmed. "Human, unless I miss my guess. This person did not walk away with the others." Jack felt his stomach turn. So at least one of the crew died aboard. "Maybe all of them did," Morrison said, straightening up. "Maybe what we found in that room is not where they undressed. Maybe it is where they died, and their bodies rotted away, leaving nothing but clothes behind." It was a rational explanation, or as rational as anything about this situation could be. But it did not account for the warm walls, or the careful arrangement of the clothing, or the symbols everywhere. And it certainly did not explain what Jack heard next. A sound from above them from the deck. Not the random creak of settling metal, but something rhythmic and purposeful. Footsteps, just as he had heard yesterday, pacing back and forth with mechanical regularity. Morrison heard it too. His hand tightened on his rifle and he exchanged a glance with Jack. "Someone else is aboard," he whispered. Jack wanted to tell him that no one could be aboard, that the ship was abandoned, and whatever they were hearing was not human. But before he could speak, Morrison was moving toward a ladder that led upward, climbing toward the deck with his rifle at the ready. Jack followed because he had no choice, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. They emerged onto the deck through a hatch, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding after the darkness below. Morrison swept his rifle in a wide arc, searching for the source of the footsteps they had heard, but the deck was empty. No crew, no salvagers, no one living or dead. Just rusted metal and bird droppings in the endless expanse of ocean beyond. The footsteps had stopped the moment they climbed onto the deck, as if whatever made them had been waiting for an audience and then fallen silent. Morrison walked the length of the deck, checking behind equipment and peering into dark corners, but found nothing. "There is nobody here," he said finally, frustration evident in his voice. "But we both heard something." Jack said nothing, afraid that if he opened his mouth, all the terror and confusion of the past day would come pouring out. Instead, he focused on examining the deck itself, looking for some clue as to what had happened to this ship and its crew. What he found only deepened the mystery. The lifeboats were still in their davits, secured and covered, never launched. If the crew had abandoned ship, they had not used the standard method of escape. And there were no signs of violence, no damage from weapons or fighting. No bloodstains or scorch marks that might suggest conflict. Morrison found the ship's nameplate near the bow, covered in rust, but still legible. "The Persephone," he read aloud. "Out of Jakarta." Jack felt a chill run down his spine at the name. Persephone, the Greek goddess who had been dragged down into the underworld, who spent half her life in darkness and death. It seemed a singularly appropriate name for a vessel that had become a tomb. They spent another hour aboard the ship, exploring the bridge and the engine room and the various cargo holds. Everywhere they went, they found the same strange symbols, the same evidence of careful organization, the same absence of crew. And everywhere, that persistent warmth in the walls and the sense of being watched by eyes they could not see. By the time they climbed back down to the beach, both men were unsettled in ways they could not quite articulate. Morrison stood looking at the ship for a long time, his weathered face troubled. "I will send word to the authorities," he said finally. "The Maritime Commission and the sheriff, both. They will want to examine this themselves. In the meantime, I want you to stay away from here. Do not come back to this beach. Do not go near that ship. Consider this section of the property off limits until someone official has had a chance to investigate." Jack nodded, more than happy to comply with that order. As they rode back up the cliff trail, he could feel the ship's presence behind him like a weight, like something watching them depart with malevolent patience. Whatever secrets the Persephone held, they were not meant for simple cowboys to uncover. They required someone with authority, with resources, with a kind of knowledge that could make sense of the impossible. The authorities arrived 3 days later, a collection of official vehicles making their way down the rough coastal road to the Morrison Ranch. There were men from the Maritime Commission, a detective from the county sheriff's office, and a professor from the university who specialized in marine disasters. Jack watched them unload their equipment from the ranch house porch, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that someone else would now be responsible for dealing with whatever was aboard the Persephone. Apprehension because he knew they would want to question him, and he still had not decided how much of the truth he was willing to share. The detective was a man named Carson, lean and sharp-eyed with the kind of face that suggested he had seen enough of human nature to be permanently suspicious of it. He found Jack in the barn that afternoon, ostensibly checking on the horses, but really just trying to stay out of the way. "You are the one who found the ship," Carson said. It was not a question. Jack nodded, continuing to brush Dusty's coat with long, steady strokes. "Yes, sir. 3 days ago, while checking fence lines down on the South Beach. Tell me what you saw." So Jack told him, carefully editing the story as he went. He described spotting the ship from a distance, approaching out of curiosity, going aboard through the tear in the hull. He mentioned the cargo hold and the crew quarters, the stacks of empty clothing, the boot in the passage with its grim contents, but he left out the warm walls, the vibration he had felt, the footsteps he had heard. Those details seemed too strange to share, too likely to make him sound unreliable or unbalanced. Carson listened without interrupting, making occasional notes in a small leather-bound book. When Jack finished, the detective studied him for a long moment. "That is everything?" he asked. "Everything I saw," Jack replied, which was technically true if incomplete. Carson's expression suggested he knew there was more, but he did not press the issue. "The professor wants to talk to you as well," he said. "Professor Whitmore. He has some theories about what might have happened to the crew." Jack found Whitmore in the ranch house parlor an hour later, surrounded by books and papers and photographs. The professor was older than Jack had expected, probably in his 70s, with white hair and kind eyes behind thick spectacles. He looked more like someone's grandfather than an expert on maritime disasters. But when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades spent studying the sea and its mysteries. "Mr. Mercer," he said, gesturing Jack to a chair. "Thank you for speaking with me." I understand this has been a disturbing experience. That is one way to put it, Jack agreed, settling into the offered seat. Whitmore spread several photographs across the table between them. These are other ships that have been found abandoned in recent years, he said. The Mary Celeste is the most famous, but there have been others. In every case, the crew simply vanished, leaving behind their belongings and no explanation for what happened to them. Jack studied the photographs. They showed vessels of various types and sizes, from small fishing boats to large merchant ships. Some looked pristine, as if the crew had just stepped away for a moment. Others showed signs of struggle or damage. But in every image, there was that same eerie quality of absence, of lives interrupted mid-motion. "What do you think happened to them?" Jack asked. Whitmore removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to be more about buying time to organize his thoughts than actual necessity. "There are many theories," he said finally. "Some believe in piracy, though that does not explain why the ships themselves were left intact. Others suggest disease or mass poisoning, though bodies are rarely found. There are even those who speak of supernatural causes, though I am not inclined toward such explanations." "But you have a theory," Jack prompted. Whitmore replaced his glasses and looked at Jack with those kind, serious eyes. "I believe something happens at sea sometimes, something we do not yet understand. A phenomenon that affects the human mind, causes hallucinations or compulsions that drive entire crews to abandon ship for no rational reason. Perhaps it is related to atmospheric conditions or magnetic fields, or some combination of factors we have not identified. Whatever it is, it leaves the ships intact but takes the people." Jack thought about the warm walls of the Persephone, the footsteps on the deck, the careful arrangement of clothing in the crew quarters. "Does your theory account for why the crews would undress first?" he asked. "Why they would organize their belongings so carefully before disappearing?" "That," Whitmore admitted, "is one of the aspects I cannot explain. The behavior suggests ritual or compulsion, as if they were following instructions from some source we cannot detect." The conversation was interrupted by Morrison entering the room, his face grim. "They found something," he said, "down in the engine room." "Something you need to see." Jack felt his stomach drop. He had not gone down to the engine room during his brief exploration of the ship, had not ventured into the deepest parts of the vessel. Now, seeing Morrison's expression, he wondered what horrors might be waiting there. They made their way down to the beach as a group, Jack and Morrison, Detective Carson, and Professor Whitmore, along with several men from the Maritime Commission. The sun was lower in the sky now, painting the Persephone in shades of orange and gold that made it look almost beautiful in a harsh, terrible way. One of the commission men led them through the ship to a ladder that descended into darkness. They had rigged work lights, harsh electric bulbs that cast everything in stark relief, making the shadows deeper and more ominous. The engine room was a cathedral of machinery, massive diesel engines and generators that had once powered the ship across thousands of miles of ocean. Now they sat silent and still, monuments to a journey that had ended in mystery. But it was not the engines that Morrison had wanted them to see. In the center of the room, someone had used paint or blood. Jack could not tell which to create a massive symbol on the floor. It was circular, with complex geometric patterns radiating from the center, and within those patterns were more of the pictographs they had seen throughout the ship. But this was different. This was not random graffiti or desperate scratching. This was deliberate, artistic, the work of someone with knowledge and purpose. Professor Whitmore knelt beside it, his face pale in the harsh light. "I have seen something like this before," he said quietly. "Where?" Carson asked. "In a monastery in Tibet," Whitmore replied. "The monks there had a similar symbol painted on their temple floor. They said it was a door." A door to what? Jack heard himself ask, though part of him did not want to know the answer. They would not say, Whitmore replied, but they were terrified of it. Said it was a threshold between this world and somewhere else, somewhere that should not be accessed by mortal men. The silence that followed was heavy, with implication. Carson was the first to break it. Are you suggesting the crew of this ship was engaged in some kind of occult ritual? He asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. I am suggesting, Whitmore said carefully, that they may have believed they were. Whether such a ritual could actually accomplish anything beyond driving them mad is another question entirely. Jack circled the symbol, careful not to step on any part of it. Up close, he could see that what he had taken for paint was indeed something else. The color was wrong, too dark and too organic, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the copper tang of old blood. One of the commission men had been examining the walls around the symbol, and now he called out in alarm. Gentlemen, you need to see this. He was pointing to a series of marks carved into the metal, words in English this time rather than symbols. Jack moved closer to read them, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They are coming through, the message read. We opened the door, and they are coming through. God forgive us for what we have done. The words were followed by a date, carved with what must have been frantic haste, given the uneven nature of the letters. The date was 3 years ago, October 15th. Jack did a quick calculation in his head. 3 years this ship had been sitting on that beach, empty and abandoned, its crew vanished into whatever darkness they had summoned. 3 years of wind and rain and tide, slowly claiming the vessel while its terrible secret lay hidden in the engine room. What does it mean? Morrison asked. Who was coming through? No one answered, because no one knew. They stood around that symbol in the harsh electric light, each man lost in his own thoughts and fears. Jack found himself wondering about the crew of the Persephone, about what they had seen or experienced that had driven them to create this thing. Had they really opened some door to another world? Or had they simply driven themselves mad with belief and ritual? The sound, when it came, made every man in the room jump. It was the same rhythmic pacing Jack had heard on his first visit, footsteps crossing the deck above their heads. Slow and measured and utterly impossible because they had left no one aboard when they descended to the engine room. Carson had his weapon drawn in an instant, the detective's training overriding his skepticism. Everyone stay here, he ordered. I am going to check it out. But before he could move toward the ladder, the footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard something else. A voice, faint and distant, calling out in a language Jack did not recognize. It might have been the wind, or the creak of metal, or the cry of gulls outside, but it sounded disturbingly like words, like someone or something trying to communicate across an impossible distance. Detective Carson went up the ladder first, his revolver held ready, followed by 2 of the Maritime Commission men who had armed themselves with heavy wrenches. Jack climbed after them, his mouth dry with fear, every instinct screaming at him to go the other direction. Professor Whitmore remained below, too old for such exertions, but his voice followed them up. Be careful. Whatever happened to the original crew, we do not want to repeat their mistakes. The deck was empty when they emerged, just as it had been during Jack's previous visits. The afternoon sun was sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rusted metal. Carson moved methodically, checking every possible hiding place, but found nothing. The voice they had heard, if it had been a voice at all, had fallen silent. One of the commission men, a younger fellow with nervous eyes, pointed toward the rail. Sir, look at this. They gathered around what he had found. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the rust as if the metal had been soft. They led from the center of the deck to the rail, overlapping and confused, suggesting a crowd of people all moving in the same direction. Jack followed the trail with his eyes and felt his heart sink. The handprints went over the rail, disappearing at the edge where someone or many someones had climbed over. They went into the water, Morrison said quietly. The old rancher had followed them up, despite his age, moving with the determination of a man who needed to see things through. All 32 of them just walked to the rail and threw themselves into the ocean. Carson was examining the prints more closely, his detective's mind working through the evidence. "These are old," he said. "Years old, based on the rust accumulation. This happened when the ship first beached, or shortly after. But why?" one of the commission men asked. "Why would an entire crew commit mass suicide?" Professor Whitmore's voice came from below, calling up through the hatch. "Because they thought they had to. Because whatever they believed they had summoned through that symbol gave them no choice." Jack walked to the rail and looked down at the beach below. The sand there was smooth and undisturbed. No bodies, no bones. Nothing to suggest that 32 men had plunged to their deaths from this height. The ocean would have taken them, he supposed, dragged them out with the tide and scattered them across the Pacific. Or perhaps they had never hit the water at all. Perhaps they had gone somewhere else entirely through whatever door they believed they had opened. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. He turned back to find the others watching him, and in their faces he saw the same fear, the same dawning realization that they were dealing with something beyond normal human experience. "We need to leave," Jack said. "Now, while we still can." Carson looked like he wanted to argue, but Morrison nodded in agreement. "The boy is right. Whatever happened here, it is beyond our ability to deal with. We should seal this ship, post guards to keep people away, and let someone with more expertise handle it." But even as they made their way back through the vessel toward the opening in the hull, Jack knew it would not be that simple. The Persephone had sat on this beach for 3 years, silent and waiting. What had changed? Why had it suddenly started manifesting these phenomena, the footsteps and voices and sense of malevolent presence? And then it hit him. He had changed things. By going aboard, by discovering the ship and bringing others to investigate, he had given it attention. He had acknowledged its existence. And somehow that acknowledgement had awakened something. They emerged onto the beach as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that reminded Jack uncomfortably of the symbol in the engine room. The group stood in silence for a moment, catching their breath, each man processing what they had witnessed. Professor Whitmore was the last to exit, moving slowly and carefully, his age showing in the tremor of his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. "I have been studying maritime mysteries for 40 years, the professor said, his voice shaken. "I have investigated dozens of abandoned ships, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, read every account and theory ever published. But I have never encountered anything like this." "What are we supposed to do with it?" Morrison asked. "We cannot just leave it sitting here. It is on my land, and people will want answers." Carson holstered his weapon, his face set in grim lines. "I am going to recommend that the ship be destroyed, burned or blown up or dragged back out to sea and sunk. Whatever we do, we need to make sure no one else comes aboard." Jack thought about the symbol in the engine room, about the door the crew claimed to have opened. Would destroying the ship close that door, or would it simply release whatever they had summoned? The question seemed important, vital even, but he had no idea how to answer it. The walk back to the horses was subdued, each man lost in his own thoughts. Jack noticed that everyone kept glancing back at the ship, as if expecting it to suddenly spring to life or reveal some new horror. But the Persephone remained still and silent, a rusted hulk slowly being reclaimed by nature. Yet the stillness felt wrong somehow, like the calm before a storm. As they reached the cliff trail, one of the commission men let out a cry of alarm. The horses were gone, not just untied and wandering, but completely vanished. The ropes they had been secured with lay on the ground, neatly coiled as if by careful hands. The sand around the area showed no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate where 5 horses had gone or how they had disappeared. "This is impossible," Carson said, stating the obvious. "Horses do not just vanish." Morrison was examining the ground with the practiced eye of a man who had tracked animals his entire life. "No prints," he confirmed. "Nothing leading away from here. It is like they were lifted straight up into the air." Jack felt the fear that had been building all day crystallize into full-blown terror. The ship was not content to simply exist anymore. It was reaching out, taking things, exerting influence beyond its rusted hull. First the horses, but what would be next? He voiced the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to ask. How are we supposed to get back to the ranch house? The answer came from an unexpected source. A truck engine growing louder as it approached along the coastal road. They climbed to the top of the cliff to find one of Morrison's ranch hands pulling up in a battered pickup, his face creased with worry. "Boss, I saw your horses running loose near the north pasture," he called out. "Thought something might be wrong, so I came looking." "How did they get there?" Morrison asked. The north pasture was 5 miles inland, a journey that should have taken hours. The ranch hand shrugged. "Do not know, but they were spooked worse than I have ever seen horses spooked. Took me an hour just to catch your gray, and I still have not managed to get the others." They crowded into the truck bed for the ride back, too shaken to question their good fortune too closely. Jack sat with his back against the cab, watching the ocean disappear behind them as they drove inland. In the fading light, he could just make out the dark shape of the Persephone still sitting on the beach, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw figures moving on its deck. 32 of them, he thought. 32 crew members who had opened a door they could not close and paid for their curiosity with their lives and perhaps their souls. That night, Jack lay in his bunk, unable to sleep once again. But this time it was not just fear keeping him awake. It was guilt. He had found that ship. He had gone aboard. He had brought others to investigate, and in doing so, he might have made everything worse. The Persephone had been dormant for 3 years, its terrible secret locked away in darkness. Now it was waking up, reaching out, demonstrating powers that defied rational explanation. Around midnight he heard it, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from the direction of the coast. Footsteps, slow and measured, pacing back and forth. And beneath that sound, barely audible, the whisper of voices speaking in that strange language he did not recognize. Jack pulled his blanket over his head like a child hiding from monsters, knowing it would do no good. Whatever was aboard the Persephone was not bound by distance anymore. It could reach him here, 5 miles from the beach, in the supposed safety of the ranch. The question was not whether it would reach him. The question was what it wanted. He must have finally dozed off near dawn, because he woke to Morrison shaking his shoulder, the rancher's face grave in the early morning light. "They are here," Morrison said. "Federal agents, maritime authorities, even military." Someone high up decided this was serious enough to warrant a major response. Jack dressed quickly and followed Morrison to the ranch house. The yard was filled with official vehicles, men in suits and uniforms moving with purposeful efficiency. A command center had been set up in Morrison's barn, complete with radios and maps and equipment Jack did not recognize. A man in a naval uniform approached them, his bearing suggesting high rank. "Commander Hayes," he introduced himself. "I understand you two were aboard the vessel yesterday. We need a complete debriefing. Everything you saw, everything you heard, every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant." Jack and Morrison spent the next 2 hours recounting their experiences, this time holding nothing back. Jack described the warm walls, the vibration, the footsteps he had heard on both visits. Morrison added his own observations about the symbols and the handprints on the rail. When they finished, Commander Hayes sat back with a troubled expression. "This is not the first time," Commander Hayes said after a long silence. "The Persephone is not the first ship we have found with these characteristics." Jack felt his blood run cold. "There have been others?" he asked. Hayes nodded slowly, as if weighing how much to reveal. 7 that we know of over the past 15 years. All found abandoned, all with similar symbols carved or painted throughout, all with evidence that the crews simply walked off the vessels and disappeared without a trace. And in every case, anyone who investigated reported the same phenomena you described: the sounds, the warmth, the sense of presence. Morrison leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. "What are we dealing with here, Commander? What could cause this to happen to multiple ships across different oceans?" Hayes pulled out a manila folder and spread several photographs across the table. They showed ships similar to the Persephone, some larger, some smaller, but all sharing that same quality of abandonment and wrongness. In each photograph, Jack could see symbols similar to the ones they had found, variations on the circular pattern with the geometric designs radiating outward. "The official position," Hayes said carefully, "is that these are cases of mass hysteria or collective delusion brought on by isolation, poor ventilation, and possibly toxic substances aboard the ships. Carbon monoxide poisoning can cause hallucinations. Certain molds produce compounds that affect mental state. We have documented cases of entire crews being affected simultaneously." "But you do not believe that?" Jack said, reading the doubt in the commander's eyes. Hayes met his gaze directly. "No, Mr. Mercer, I do not. I have been to 3 of these ships personally. I have felt what you felt. I have heard what you heard. And I have seen things that no amount of gas poisoning or mold exposure can explain." One of Hayes's subordinates, a young lieutenant with nervous energy, interjected, "Sir, should we be discussing this with civilians?" The commander shot him a look that silenced further objections. "These men have already been exposed. They deserve to know what they are dealing with." He turned back to Jack and Morrison. "What I am about to tell you is classified, but given the circumstances, I believe you have earned the right to hear it." Hayes pulled out another photograph, this one older and more worn than the others. "This is the SS Orang Medan," he said, "found adrift in Indonesian waters in 1947. The entire crew was dead, frozen in expressions of terror, their eyes wide open, mouths agape as if they had seen something horrifying in their final moments. When the rescue crew boarded, they reported an overwhelming sense of cold despite the tropical heat, and a smell like sulfur or brimstone. Before they could tow the ship to port, it caught fire and sank, conveniently destroying all evidence," Morrison observed. Hayes's expression was grim. "We thought so too. But over the years, similar incidents kept occurring. Different ships, different crews, always the same pattern. The symbols, the disappearances, the phenomena. And always, when we tried to investigate thoroughly, something prevented it. Ships sinking, evidence disappearing, witnesses recanting their stories or being discredited." "What does the government think is happening?" Jack asked. "The official government position is that there is no pattern," Hayes replied. "Each incident is treated as a separate maritime mystery with conventional explanations. But there are those of us who believe otherwise. We think someone or something is using these ships for a purpose we do not yet understand. The symbols suggest ritual, organization, intent. The crews were not victims of random tragedy. They were participants in something deliberate." Jack thought about the message carved into the engine room wall. "They are coming through." We opened the door. "What kind of door?" he asked. "Do you think the crews were trying to open?" Hayes was quiet for a moment, as if wrestling with how much to reveal. "There are references in ancient texts," he said finally, "to thresholds between worlds, places where the boundary between our reality and others grows thin. Most scholars dismiss such texts as mythology or primitive superstition. But what if they were not entirely wrong? What if there are indeed other places, other dimensions that exist alongside our own, separated by barriers we do not normally perceive? "You are talking about the supernatural," Morrison said, his tone skeptical but not entirely dismissive. A man who had spent a lifetime on the frontier had learned not to reject possibilities too quickly. Hayes shook his head. "I am talking about physics we do not yet understand. Quantum mechanics has shown us that reality at its most fundamental level behaves in ways that seem impossible by everyday standards. Particles in two places at once, information transmitted instantaneously across vast distances. Who is to say there are not other realities existing in parallel to our own, normally inaccessible but potentially reachable under certain conditions?" The lieutenant who had objected earlier spoke up again. "Sir, the team is ready to board the vessel. We are just waiting for your authorization." Hayes stood, his decision made. "We go in with full precautions, hazmat suits, recording equipment, armed escort. I want everything documented. If this ship is going to give us answers, today is the day we get them." Jack found himself standing as well. "I am coming with you." Hayes started to object, but Jack cut him off. "That ship has been in my head for days now. I can hear it at night, feel it pulling at me. If there are answers to be found, I have a right to be there when you find them." The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Against my better judgment, I agree. But you follow orders. You stay close to my men. And if I tell you to evacuate, you move immediately, understood?" "Understood," Jack confirmed, though part of him wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. They assembled at the cliff top an hour later, a team of 20 men equipped with everything from scientific instruments to military weapons. Jack felt woefully unprepared in his simple cowboy clothes, but Hayes had given him a radio and a flashlight, tools that would at least let him communicate and see in the darkness. Morrison had been ordered to stay behind, much to the old rancher's displeasure, but he had accepted the decision with characteristic grace. The descent to the beach was tense and silent. Every man in the group had been briefed on what to expect, but knowing intellectually that you might encounter something impossible was different from being prepared to face it. Jack could feel the fear radiating from the team, mixing with his own anxiety until the air itself seemed charged with nervous energy. The Persephone sat waiting for them exactly as they had left it, a monument of rust and secrets. But as they approached, Jack noticed something new. The tier in the hull, the opening they had been using to access the interior, had changed. It was larger now, the metal bent outward as if something had pushed from inside. And around the edges of the opening, more of those symbols had appeared, painted in that dark substance that might have been blood. Hayes saw it too, and held up a hand to halt the advance. "That was not there yesterday," he said. Jack confirmed with a nod. "It has grown. The ship is changing." One of the scientists, a woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, moved forward to examine the new symbols with a handheld device that clicked and beeped. "Radiation levels normal," she reported. "No toxic gases detected. But this paint, or whatever it is fresh. Hours old at most." "How is that possible?" the lieutenant asked. "There has been no one near this ship since we established our perimeter." The scientist shook her head, clearly troubled. "I cannot explain it, but the chemical composition of this substance is organic, biological. It is definitely blood, and it is definitely human." Jack felt his stomach turn. "Whose blood?" he asked. "Where did it come from?" No one had an answer. Hayes made a decision. "We proceed as planned, but with extreme caution. Scientific team, you stay outside and monitor. Military escort, you are with me. Mr. Mercer, you stay close to Lieutenant Foster here. If anything happens, he will get you out." They entered the ship through the enlarged opening, and immediately Jack felt it. The warmth was stronger than before, almost oppressive. The vibration he had noticed on his first visit was pronounced now, a steady pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The team's flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar interior of the cargo hold, but something was different. The walls were covered in new symbols, hundreds of them, overlapping and intertwining in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "This was not here 2 days ago," Hayes said, his voice tight with tension. "The ship is active. It is responding to our presence." They moved deeper into the vessel, following the passage toward the crew quarters. Jack's radio crackled with static, then cleared to carry the voice of the scientist outside. "Commander, we are picking up unusual electromagnetic readings. The field strength is increasing exponentially. Whatever is generating this, it is building toward something." Hayes acknowledged the report and pressed forward. When they reached the crew quarters, they found the stacks of clothing exactly as before, but now they were arranged in a perfect circle around the center of the room. And in that center, something new had appeared. A hole in the floor, perfectly circular, about 3 feet in diameter. It had not been cut or burned. The metal simply ended, as if that portion of the deck had never existed. Hayes approached the hole cautiously and shined his light down into it. The beam seemed to bend and distort, showing glimpses of something below that should not have been possible. The hole went down much farther than the ship's hull could accommodate, deeper than the ocean floor beneath them. It was as if the ship existed in 2 spaces at once, occupying both the beach where they could see it and somewhere else entirely. "Do not get too close," Jack warned, his voice hoarse with fear. The commander heeded the warning, backing away from the edge. He turned to one of his men. "Get me the rope and a camera. We need to document what is down there." While they waited for the equipment, Jack found himself drawn to the circle of clothing. Up close, he could see that each stack had been arranged with mathematical precision, equidistant from the hole at the center. And each pile now had something new sitting atop it. Small objects that gleamed dully in the flashlight beams. He knelt beside the nearest stack and picked up the object, his hands shaking. It was a wedding ring, simple gold, worn smooth from years of wear. He checked the next stack and found another ring, then another. 32 rings for 32 crew members, each one placed carefully on the clothes of its former owner. But how? The rings had not been there 2 days ago. Jack was certain of that. Who had arranged them? Who had known where each ring belonged? Commander Hayes joined him, examining one of the rings in the beam of his flashlight. "They left everything behind," he said quietly. "Their clothes, their wedding rings, every physical connection to their lives, as if they were shedding their humanity before they descended." "Descended where?" Jack asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Hayes gestured toward the hole in the floor. "Through the door, they opened, into whatever lies on the other side." The team member returned with rope and a small waterproof camera. Hayes secured the camera to the end of the rope and began lowering it into the hole. They watched the rope disappear, foot after foot, far more than should have been possible. 10 feet, 20, 30. At 50 feet, Hayes stopped. The rope was taut, the weight of the camera pulling it straight down, but there was something wrong. The rope was not hanging vertically. It angled off to the side, as if gravity itself was different in whatever space existed below them. Hayes activated the camera remotely and studied the small monitor connected to it. His face went pale in the dim light. "Sweet, merciful God," he breathed. "What is it?" Lieutenant Foster asked, moving closer. Hayes turned the monitor so they could see. The image was distorted, flickering, but clear enough to make out details that defied comprehension. The camera was showing a vast space, far larger than the interior of the ship could possibly contain. It was a cavern or chamber of some kind, its walls covered in those same geometric symbols they had seen throughout the vessel. But these symbols glowed with a faint phosphorescent light, creating a sickly green illumination that revealed the chamber's true horror. There were figures down there, dozens of them, possibly hundreds. They stood in perfect formation, arranged in concentric circles around a central point, and they were not entirely human anymore. Jack could see that even through the distorted camera image. Their proportions were wrong, limbs too long, bodies twisted in ways that should have been impossible. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something, or as if they had been waiting for a very long time. Hayes pulled the camera back up, his movements jerky with barely controlled panic. "We need to leave, now." His radio crackled to life before anyone could move. "Commander, this is base camp. We have a situation. The electromagnetic field around the ship just spiked. We are reading energy levels that should not be possible." "What do you mean, should not be possible?" Hayes demanded. "I mean the instruments are showing power output equivalent to a small nuclear reactor," the scientist's voice replied, tight with fear. "And it is increasing. Whatever is happening in there, it is building towards some kind of critical event." The ship groaned around them, a sound like metal screaming in agony. The vibration Jack had felt earlier intensified, becoming violent enough to make standing difficult. The lights from their flashlights flickered and dimmed, as if something was draining the very electricity from the batteries. And then they heard it. A sound rising from the hole in the floor, a chorus of voices speaking in unison in that strange language Jack had heard before. But this time there were words mixed in, English words that sent ice through his veins. "Come down," the voices chanted. "Come through the door. Join us in the space between. We have been waiting. We are always waiting." The hole in the floor began to widen, the metal around its edge curling back like flower petals opening to the sun. The circle of clothing started to slide toward the opening, drawn by some invisible force. One of the wedding rings rolled across the floor and disappeared into the hole, followed by another, then another, as if being called home. Hayes grabbed Jack's arm. "Everyone out. Move, move, move." They ran through the passage back toward the cargo hold, but the ship was changing around them. The walls were bending inward, the floor tilting at impossible angles. New holes were opening everywhere, each one revealing glimpses of that vast chamber below where the twisted figures waited in their eternal vigil. Jack could hear them now, not just through the holes but through the walls themselves, their voices seeping through the metal like water through a sieve. Lieutenant Foster was in the lead, his weapon drawn, though what good it would do against this Jack could not imagine. They burst into the cargo hold to find it transformed. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, pulsing in rhythm with the voices. And standing between them and the exit was a figure. It had once been human. Jack could see that much. It still wore the tattered remains of a ship's uniform, the name tag just barely legible. Captain Anderson. But what stood before them now was not entirely the man who had commanded the Persephone. Its proportions were wrong, stretched and distorted. Its eyes glowed with that same sickly green light they had seen in the chamber below. "The door is open," it said, and its voice was the voice of the chorus, dozens of tones speaking through one mouth. "The threshold is crossed. You have brought us attention, brought us focus. For 3 years we waited in silence, but now you have awakened us. Now we can complete what was begun." Hayes raised his weapon, but Jack grabbed his arm. "Shooting it will not help. It is not really here. It is just a projection, a shadow of what used to be." "How do you know that?" the commander asked. "Because I can see through it," Jack replied, and he could. The figure was translucent, like smoke or mist given temporary form. Behind it, he could see the opening in the hull, the blessed daylight beyond. But between them and freedom stood this thing that had once been a man, this guardian of the threshold. "You cannot leave," Captain Anderson's voice echoed. "You have seen too much, learned too much. The door must remain open, and you must help us keep it so. More figures were emerging from the holes that now pocked every surface of the cargo hold, crew members of the Persephone, or what remained of them, crawling up from that impossible space below. Some were more solid than others, more completely transformed. They moved with jerky, inhuman motions, their joints bending in wrong directions, their faces frozen in expressions that might have been ecstasy or agony, or something beyond human emotion entirely. Hayes made a decision. He fired his weapon, not at the figures, but at the hull beside the opening. The bullet punched through the rusted metal, creating a new hole that let in more light. The figures recoiled from it as if burned, their forms becoming more transparent where the sunlight touched them. "Light," Hayes shouted. "They cannot tolerate direct light. Everyone, fire at the walls. Create as many openings as you can." The team opened fire, their weapons thundering in the enclosed space. Holes appeared in the hull, each one admitting another shaft of sunlight. The figures screamed, a sound that made Jack's ears bleed. They retreated toward the holes in the floor, abandoning their attempt to block the exit. Foster grabbed Jack and pulled him toward the opening, Hayes and the others following close behind. They tumbled out onto the beach, gasping for air, their ears ringing from the gunfire and the inhuman screaming. Behind them, the Persephone was changing. The entire hull was glowing now, that same sickly green light they had seen below. The symbols blazed with impossible brightness. And the ship was sinking, not into the sand, but into itself, as if being pulled down into that vast chamber that existed in the space between spaces. "Run," Hayes ordered. "Get to high ground." They ran across the beach toward the cliff trail, not looking back, not daring to stop. Behind them, the ship groaned and shrieked, metal tearing, reality itself seeming to fold and collapse. Jack risked one glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he had not. The Persephone was half gone, the upper portion of the hull simply ceasing to exist, revealing that impossible chamber beneath. And in that chamber, the figures were moving now, climbing toward the opening, reaching for the surface world they had been separated from. They reached the base of the cliff trail just as the first of the transformed crew emerged onto the beach. Jack saw it clearly in the dying afternoon light, a thing that had once been human but was now something else entirely. It moved with unnatural speed, its elongated limbs carrying it across the sand in great loping strides. Behind it came others, pouring out of the dissolving ship like insects from a disturbed hive. Hayes turned and fired, his bullets passing through the nearest figure without apparent effect. "They are not solid enough to stop with conventional weapons," he shouted. "Just keep moving." The climb up the cliff trail had never seemed so long. Jack's lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but terror drove him upward with strength he did not know he possessed. Lieutenant Foster was ahead of him, Hayes behind, the rest of the team scattered along the trail. Below them, the creatures that had been the crew of the Persephone were giving chase, their inhuman voices raised in that terrible chant. "Come down, come through, join us in the space between." Halfway up the trail, one of the team members stumbled and fell. Jack turned to help him, but Hayes grabbed his shoulder. "Keep going, I will get him." The commander scrambled back down to where the man had fallen, hauling him to his feet. But the creatures were close now, too close. Jack watched in horror as the nearest one reached out with its impossibly long arms and touched the fallen team member. The man's scream cut off abruptly as his body began to change, flesh rippling and distorting, bones bending into new configurations. In seconds, he had become one of them, his face frozen in an expression of transcendent horror. Hayes fired point blank into the creature that had been his subordinate, but the bullets had no effect. The transformed man reached for the commander with those terrible elongated fingers, and Hayes did the only thing he could. He dove off the trail, falling 20 feet to the rocks below. Jack heard the impact, saw the commander's body lie still, and felt something break inside him. This was his fault. He had found the ship, had drawn attention to it, had awakened whatever slept within its cursed hull. But there was no time for guilt. The creatures were still coming, and more of the team were falling, either from exhaustion or from the touch of those things that had once been men. Jack reached the top of the cliff to find Morrison waiting with the ranch hands, all armed with rifles and shotguns. The old rancher took one look at Jack's face and knew without asking that something had gone catastrophically wrong. "They are right behind me," Jack gasped. "Some of our men are down. Hayes is down." Morrison did not hesitate. He began barking orders, positioning his men along the cliff edge, preparing a defensive line. As the first of the creatures crested the trail, the ranchers opened fire. The shotgun blasts were more effective than Hayes's pistol had been, the spread of buckshot disrupting the creatures' forms even if it could not destroy them. The things recoiled, falling back down the trail, but Jack knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "We need to destroy the ship," he said urgently. "As long as that door is open, those things will keep coming." Morrison nodded grimly. "I radioed for the military before you came up. They are sending bombers, jets with payloads that can level that beach, but it will take time we might not have." "How long?" Jack asked. "An hour. Maybe less." Morrison's expression was grim. "We need to hold this position until then." The creatures regrouped and came again, this time spreading out, trying to flank the defensive position. The ranch hands fired steadily, their training with weapons serving them well. But for every creature they forced back, another appeared from the beach below. Jack could see the Persephone now from his vantage point, or what remained of it. The ship was almost completely gone, swallowed by that impossible chamber. But the chamber itself was expanding, spreading beyond the bounds of where the ship had been, a wound in reality that was growing larger with each passing moment. Morrison handed Jack a rifle. "You know how to use this?" he asked. Jack nodded, taking the weapon with hands that had steadied despite his fear. He had hunted rabbits and deer as a boy, before poverty and bad luck had stripped away everything but the clothes on his back and his loyal mare. The skills came back to him now, muscle memory guiding his movements as he took up position beside the ranch hands. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded Jack uncomfortably of blood. In the fading light, the creatures seemed more solid, more real. They were learning, adapting to this world they had been separated from. Jack could see them becoming more coordinated in their attacks, working together with disturbing intelligence. One group would rush the defensive line while another tried to circle around, forcing the defenders to split their attention. And they were not the only threat. The chamber itself was growing, spreading up the cliff face like a cancer. Where it touched the rock, the stone began to change, taking on that same sickly green glow they had seen inside the ship. Morrison saw it too and made a decision. Everyone back. Fall back to the ranch house. We cannot hold this position if the ground beneath us becomes unstable. They retreated in good order, the ranch hands providing covering fire as they moved. But the creatures followed, emboldened by their retreat. Jack could see more of them emerging from the chamber now, not just the crew of the Persephone but others. Older figures, dressed in clothing from different eras. Sailors from ships that had disappeared decades or even centuries ago, all of them transformed, all of them serving whatever intelligence existed in that space between. The ranch house came into view, its familiar outline a reminder of normality in a world gone mad. Morrison's wife and the other women had barricaded themselves inside, but they came out now with more ammunition, their faces pale but determined. Jack had always admired frontier women, the strength it took to build lives in harsh country. That strength was on full display now as they worked alongside the men, preparing for a siege against enemies that should not exist. The radio in Morrison's truck crackled to life. "This is Flight Leader Delta. We are inbound on your position. ETA 15 minutes, clear the beach area. Repeat, clear the beach area. We are authorized for maximum payload." Morrison grabbed the radio. "Roger that, Delta. Be advised, the target has changed. It is no longer just a ship. There is some kind of spatial anomaly expanding from the beach. You need to hit it with everything you have got." A pause, then the pilot's voice came back, tense but professional. "Understood. We have visual on your position. We see the anomaly." "My God, what is that thing?" "Just kill it," Morrison replied, "before it spreads any further." The creatures had reached the ranch house perimeter now, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They moved with purpose, surrounding the building, cutting off escape routes. Jack fired methodically, aiming for the ones that seemed most solid, most complete in their transformation. Each shot disrupted their forms temporarily, buying precious seconds, but ammunition was finite, and the creatures seemed endless. Inside the ranch house, Morrison's wife Sarah was organizing the defense with the calm efficiency of a general. She had been a schoolteacher before marrying Morrison, and that organizational skill served her well now. Every window had defenders. Every entrance was barricaded. She even had the presence of mind to fill containers with water, knowing they might be trapped for hours. Jack found himself thinking of Dusty, wondering if his faithful mare had survived the earlier chaos, hoping she had run far from this place of nightmare and death. The sound of jet engines cut through the evening air, a roar that promised salvation or destruction. Jack could not see the aircraft yet, but he could feel them approaching, could sense the terrible power they carried. The creatures seemed to sense it too. They abandoned their cautious approach and rushed the ranch house in a coordinated assault, throwing themselves against doors and windows with mindless fury. The defenders fired as fast as they could work their weapons, the air thick with gun smoke and the smell of cordite. A window shattered on the second floor, and one of the creatures forced its way through. Jack heard screams from above, the sounds of struggle. He abandoned his position and ran upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. He found the thing in one of the bedrooms, its impossible form filling the small space. One of the ranch wives was backed into a corner, her rifle empty, her face frozen in terror. Jack did not think. He simply acted, swinging his rifle like a club, smashing it into the creature's elongated skull. The impact sent vibrations up his arms that felt wrong, as if he had struck something that existed partially in another dimension. But it worked. The creature recoiled, its form flickering and destabilizing. He grabbed the woman and pulled her from the room, slamming the door behind them. Downstairs, Morrison was shouting coordinates into the radio, guiding the bombers toward their target. 30 seconds. Everyone away from the south side of the house. Take cover. Jack threw himself to the floor, covering his head with his arms. The woman he had saved did the same, her body shaking with shock. Around them, the other defenders were seeking whatever shelter they could find, understanding that what was about to happen would change everything. The first bomb hit the beach with a sound that redefined Jack's understanding of loud. The ranch house shook on its foundations, windows shattering from the pressure wave. Then came the second bomb, and the third, a rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Jack risked a glance through the shattered window and saw a pillar of fire rising from the beach, a column of destruction that reached toward the sky like the wrath of an angry god. The creatures surrounding the ranch house stopped their assault as if pulled by invisible strings. They turned as one toward the beach, toward the source of the destruction, their inhuman faces tilted upward. Jack watched in horrified fascination as they began to dissolve, their forms becoming transparent, flickering like candle flames in a strong wind. They raised their elongated arms toward the sky in what might have been supplication or despair, and then they were gone, vanishing like smoke on the breeze. The bombing continued for 5 full minutes, wave after wave of aircraft pounding the beach with ordnance designed to level mountains. The ground shook continuously, pictures falling from walls, furniture sliding across floors. Morrison's wife had her arms around 2 of the younger ranch hands, all of them huddled together, praying or crying or both. Jack simply watched through the broken window, witnessing the obliteration of the Persephone and the impossible chamber it had become a doorway to. When the jets finally finished their run and the thunder of explosions faded, an eerie silence fell over the ranch. Jack's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear Morrison when the old rancher spoke. "Is it over? Do you think we got it?" Jack did not answer immediately. He stood and made his way carefully through the debris-strewn house to the front door. Stepping outside, he could see a massive crater where the beach had been, glowing with residual heat. The cliff itself had partially collapsed, tons of rock and earth cascading down into the depression. And of the ship, the chamber, the creatures, there was no sign. The radio crackled again. "This is Flight Leader Delta. Target destroyed. We are showing no further anomalous readings. The spatial distortion is gone." Morrison let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. "Thank you, Delta. You saved our lives. Just doing our job, sir. We have rescue and cleanup crews inbound. Recommend you evacuate the area until we can certify it is safe." The survivors gathered in the yard, taking stock of their losses. 3 ranch hands were dead, killed in the initial assault. 2 more were missing, probably transformed by the creature's touch before the bombing. Commander Hayes and 4 of his team had died on the cliff trail. Too many good men lost to something that should never have existed. Jack found himself walking away from the group, drawn toward the cliff edge by a compulsion he could not name. Morrison called after him, warning him to be careful, but Jack barely heard. He picked his way through the rubble until he could see down into the crater. It was enormous, easily 300 feet across and half that deep. The heat rising from it distorted the air, creating shimmering waves that played tricks on the eyes. At the bottom, he could see twisted metal, all that remained of the Persephone. But even as he watched, that metal was dissolving, breaking down into ash that the ocean breeze scattered across the ruined landscape. A sound behind him made Jack turn. Dusty stood there, her reins trailing, her coat matted with sweat and dirt. She must have found her way back from wherever she had run during the chaos. Jack felt tears sting his eyes at the sight of her. This horse, this simple, faithful creature, was his only constant in a world that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more terrible than he had ever imagined. He walked to her and buried his face in her neck, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and leather. She nickered softly, nuzzling his shoulder, offering what comfort a horse could give. They stood like that for a long time, man and animal, survivors of something that would haunt Jack's dreams for the rest of his life. Morrison found them there as the sun finally slipped below the horizon. The rancher looked older than he had that morning, aged by horror and loss. "They are going to want us to keep quiet about what happened here," he said. "National security, they called it. They will pay for the damages, compensate the families of the dead, but we are to tell no one the real story." Jack understood. Who would believe it anyway? A ship full of transformed crew members, a doorway to some impossible space, creatures that defied the laws of nature. It sounded like the ravings of a madman. Better to accept whatever official explanation the government offered and try to move on with life. "What will you tell people?" he asked Morrison. The old rancher shrugged. "That there was a gas leak aboard a derelict ship, that it caused hallucinations and some kind of explosion, that good men died in a tragic accident." He looked at Jack directly. "And what will you tell them?" Jack thought about it. He had spent his whole life being pitied, being seen as the poor cowboy with no future and no hope. Now he had a story that would make him seem even more pitiable, a drifter who had lost his mind out on the lonely coast. Or he could stay silent, carry the burden of what he knew and let the world think what it would. "I will tell them nothing," he said finally. I will do my job, take my pay, and move on to the next ranch, same as always. But even as he said it, Jack knew it was not entirely true. He would never be the same. He had seen behind the curtain of reality, glimpsed the spaces between spaces where impossible things waited. He had learned that the world was far larger and stranger than the small portion of it he traveled through with Dusty and his worn saddle. That knowledge would change him in ways he could not yet predict. Morrison seemed to understand. He clapped Jack on the shoulder with surprising gentleness. "You did good today, son. Kept your head when others panicked. Saved Sarah's cousin upstairs. If you ever need work, a reference, anything, you come find me. You hear?" Jack nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years. The cleanup crews arrived an hour later, military personnel and government scientists who cordoned off the entire area and began the process of erasing all evidence that the Persephone had ever existed. Jack watched them work through the night, their floodlights turning darkness into day, their equipment probing and measuring and cataloging. Professor Whitmore was among them, looking shaken but determined. He caught Jack's eye across the yard and nodded slowly, a gesture of shared understanding between two men who had looked into the abyss. 3 days later, Jack was back in the line shack, his belongings packed, ready to move on. Morrison had paid him double wages and a bonus he had not expected, money that would keep him fed through the winter and maybe beyond. The official story was already spreading through the county. A derelict ship, a gas explosion, a tragic accident. Nothing to see, nothing to remember, nothing that challenged the comfortable certainties of everyday life. Jack saddled Dusty in the pre-dawn darkness, taking his time with the familiar ritual. The mare was calm now, the terror of those days already fading from her animal memory. He envied her that simple ability to forget. His own memories were as vivid as ever, the warm walls and the footsteps and the creatures that had once been men, the symbols and the voices and the impossible chamber existing in the space between spaces. As he rode away from the Morrison ranch, Jack did not look back toward the coast. He had seen enough of the ocean to last him a lifetime. Instead, he turned Dusty inland, toward the mountains and the high country where the air was thin and clean, and the only mysteries were the ones nature provided. He would find work somewhere. He always did. He would continue his wandering life, moving from ranch to ranch, never settling, never belonging. But now he carried with him a secret that set him apart from other men in ways that had nothing to do with poverty or lack of prospects. He had learned that doors exist that should never be opened, that some thresholds were meant to remain uncrossed. That curiosity could awaken things better left sleeping in the dark places of the world. The Persephone was gone, destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remained. But Jack knew the truth. It had not been the only ship. Commander Hayes had shown him photographs of 7 others, and who knew how many more existed, scattered across the oceans of the world. Ships where desperate or curious crews had followed old rituals and opened doors they could not close. Somewhere out there, other vessels were beaching themselves on lonely shores. Other cowboys or fishermen or beachcombers were discovering them, drawn by curiosity or chance to investigate. And perhaps some of those people were making the same mistakes Jack had made, going aboard when they should have stayed away, looking when they should have turned blind eyes. The thought haunted him as Dusty carried him away from the coast, away from the Morrison Ranch, away from the crater where the Persephone had met its final end. But he also knew something else, something Commander Hayes had said during their briefing. There were people watching now, organizations that tracked these ships and tried to contain them before they could spread their infection. The military and the scientists and men like Professor Whitmore, who dedicated their lives to guarding the thresholds. Jack was just a poor cowboy, a drifter with nothing to his name but a horse and a saddle. But he had played his part in closing one door, in stopping one infection before it could spread beyond control. As the sun rose over the mountains ahead, painting the peaks in shades of gold and amber, Jack allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. Purpose. He had survived the Persephone. He had faced the impossible and lived to tell the tale, even if that tale would never be told. And in surviving, he had learned that even the poorest man, the loneliest drifter, could matter when it counted. Dusty's ears flicked back, listening for his voice, and Jack spoke to her softly. "We are okay, girl. We are going to be okay." The mare snorted and picked up her pace, eager for whatever lay ahead. And Jack Mercer, poor cowboy and unlikely hero, rode with her into the morning light, leaving behind the ocean and its terrible secrets, carrying with him memories that would never fade and knowledge that would forever change how he saw the world.